Hey, what's up guys? I'm Follygon, and in this video I'm going to talk about sketching in 3D. It's been a while since I've made one of these more casual style videos, so you'll have to let me know down in the comments if you enjoy this kind of thing. But in this video, I'm talking about this character that I sculpted that took me just a little under 3 hours to create. I think it was like 2 hours 45 or something like that. So I consider that a sketch in 3D because 3D characters of at least the quality that I create take often a lot longer than that. So anything around this time frame, at least for myself, I consider to be a sketch. And I lately have been becoming more of a fan of creating kind of a more sketchy type character. And that is for a number of reasons. Creating 3D characters takes a really long time, and I think sketches can be really powerful ways to study, to come up with, an idea really quick. But, if you're maybe trying to concept out something in terms of an idea, maybe 2D might be a better route to take for that. But there are a lot of really good benefits that can come from creating 3D characters and just doing quick little sketches like this. Like I said, it's a good way to just practice repetition, work on those early stages of creating a character like I'm doing right here. Working on the fundamental skill of blocking out, which if you're unfamiliar is working on big shapes, primary forms, kind of the foundation of everything that you're going to build on top of that. So I like sketching a lot. I am a big fan. And with this character, I kind of went into it with a rough idea of what I wanted to create, but I didn't, have a really specific image in my head. I think a lot of the time when people see really highly skilled artists, a lot of the time they think, and I've even heard some artists say this, that they have like a really clear picture in their head. But at least in my experience, and a lot of people that I know in person that are artists as well, and people that I've talked to and met, I have never personally met someone who has had that idea or opinion that they have like this perfect vision in their head and then they execute it exactly how they want to. For me, it's, a rough idea. I can kind of maybe picture something in my head, but maybe not exactly what I want it to be. And I feel like along that journey, you also discover more of what it should be. To kind of say, like, if you have an idea of something in your head, I feel like the initial idea is typically wrong or it's incorrect in some way. And along the journey of creating that piece, you kind of find out, what that really ends up being. So it's kind of a journey of discovery in some ways while starting off with kind of a basic idea. So for this, I just wanted to sketch out a female character. I wanted to put her in a simple sweatshirt. I wasn't sure how I was going to kind of terminate the bust because I'm not doing a full character, I am doing a bust. And the termination point, which if you're unfamiliar with that term, is just kind of like how you're gonna cut up the bust, If you think of like old Greco-Roman type sculptures, when you think of like a traditional bust, they're often cut into like this V-shape torso or kind of like a blocky torso shape and then set upon a pillar. In 3D, you don't have to do that though, luckily, because everything's just kind of floating in 3D space. So you don't really have to make it look like a chess piece or anything like that. But yeah, I'm currently working in this process on what's called the stage of refinement. So if you're unfamiliar with the larger kind of parts or steps of that process of sculpting or sketching out a 3D character, it kind of goes through what I would consider like 3 major buckets. The first one being block out. And you can treat that a lot of different ways. It's just essentially working on big picture ideas, like the proportions of the head to the body, blocking out some clothing, blocking out like, some basic colors, which you can see I haven't even gotten to that point yet. Refinement is that next step where you take those basic ideas that you've started working on and you start adding secondary shapes on top of those. So this would be things like facial features like your mouth, your nose, your eyes, ears, etc. So at this part of the process, it's not just about adding those, but it's about making them look good, which can take a really long time because faces are notoriously difficult. Now you can see I'm starting to get some hair onto this character sketch as well. Hair is always something that I have found really fun and enjoyable. You get into a nice flow state. Hair really helps a character kind of come together into a more finished state, or I feel like the character of your, the character, right? The character of your character kind of starts to come through a little more once you get the hair on there. And I think a lot of that is because so much of your hairstyle can really define what you look like. You know, having long hair versus being bald, you know, wearing a hat versus, you know, not wearing a hat. You know, there's a lot that can, you know, really change the appearance and feel of a character. Color is another really good example of that. And here's actually a really great example of what I was talking about before when I was talking about, you know, I have a general idea of what I want to do. You know, I'm thinking about the length of the hair right now, but even that, I end up like deleting almost all of that and put the hair in a ponytail later on. So, you know, a lot of these ideas, I feel like it's really important to maybe not get married to a specific idea or be really attached to something, because along the way you end up finding like what works and what doesn't. And a lot of that can be, I definitely struggled with this a lot more when I was in my early stages of kind of getting into art. But you have this idea that you start with, and then you feel like you really need to hold on to that. You really strictly, you know, want that thing. And a lot of the time you can make that work, but it can be, you know, kind of a struggle. You have to kind of fight your art to like force it to go where you want. And if you go in with the mindset of this is a sketch, you know, no big deal, it doesn't matter, I feel like it's a lot easier to let go of that mindset and kind of let the art lead you in a specific direction, or kind of, you know, you're controlling it, but you're allowing it to kind of flow in a non-specific direction that you can kind of say, oh, I like this, I want to kind of lean into that a little more. So that's kind of my mental philosophy a little bit on sketching and kind of where it can lead. So in terms of reference, I recommend if you're going to kind of sketch out a character, I 100% recommend using references. I was just on Pinterest kind of flipping through a ton of different faces. This ended up looking like none of them. I was looking at real people for this sketch. You don't have to always do that. You know, real human people. What a weird thing to say. People are a great source of reference for stylized characters, for, you know, realistic stuff. But I also really recommend looking at other people's artwork. I think it's a really great way to learn ideas of, you know, how they stylize or simplify ideas. Think of like the eye, right? That is not a realistic eye on that character, but it is it's a simplification of it. And it is a simplification of an eye that I have practiced and created hundreds or thousands of different ways at this point. And I've gotten to a place where I can kind of play around with a lot of different styles and have a lot of different ideas, excuse the pun. And the point I'm trying to make here is that by looking at other artists' artwork, you can kind of impart some of that knowledge that they have gained from all of that practice, those hundreds or thousands of eyes that they've made, and you can kind of get a distilled version of that information. So you might be looking at one of my eyes and you might be in the encampment of saying like, oh no, I don't use reference, or no, I only use real people as reference. But I think that you can learn a lot from, you know, looking at other artists' artwork. It's a great, it's like Spark Notes. I don't know, you know, that might be showing my age, but back in the day there was a website where you could go and get like a quick summary of a book. I'm sure there's versions of that, or people are just like up in Chat GPT like, hey, give me a summary of this book. But anyway, I think it's a great source for learning and getting some more knowledge a little more fast. So I'm kind of working on the hair a little more. going into a ponytail style. Again, at this point, I'm really not sure how I'm going to terminate this character in terms of the bust shape, but I was starting to really enjoy the face. If you were watching this during the early part of this character, you probably noticed it looked really awkward and really strange. That is a part of the sculpting process called the alien phase, or at least I call it the alien phase. A very common part of the process where things just look really bad and weird and awkward. And a lot of that has to do with sculpting being a kind of slow process of slowly building up form on top of each other. And during that process of building up those shapes, if you get distracted by how awkward and strange things look, it can be really hard to progress. But once you do it, a few times and get a few heads under your belt, it becomes easier, and it becomes even easier with time. Where I'm at right now, I am in those like really awkward, deep, crazy, terrible looking stages. And, now it's just like a little piece of the back of my brain that's like, hey, this looks really bad. Like, you should just stop, like, kind of give up on this. But I know from experience that I've done this thousands of times that, if I just kind of push through that stage, it'll be absolutely fine and end up with something new and unique. And, I think a lot of my character faces tend to look relatively similar. I think that's just kind of my art style coming through, but I do try to make each one feel unique and different from one another. And that is one of the main reasons that I sculpt everything, pretty much everything, not everything. Like, I reuse the same ear almost every time, or I reuse a handful of ears and sometimes steal some eyelashes and stuff from other characters. But for the most part, I resculpt just about everything from scratch. And, it's a really good way to discover new techniques. It's a good way to practice those early stages, which are often really slow and awkward. And it's just a really good way to come up with some unique ideas as well, as I was mentioning. So one thing that I want to mention that's actually really important right here, and I've mentioned this when I've talked about shoes with feet inside of them, or clothing with a body inside of them in this instance. I am sculpting the character's breast on top of the really awkward torso shape there, which occasionally I'll show by itself and it looks really strange. But the reason why I'm doing that is not because you're going to see the character's breast or the character's chest, right? It's so that I know the proportion and form that I can fit the clothing over top of that. So I said earlier that I wanted to create a sweatshirt for this character, and you can see I'm kind of starting to pull that out and block out that idea now. But I need to know how much room I have to work with for this character's torso. So figuring out with a really simplistic shape like a sphere or a couple, cubes or whatever you want to use to kind of figure out how much room proportionally you have to work with can be very helpful. I often mention this. I mentioned shoes earlier. If you're going to sculpt or 3D model a character with shoes, or draw a character, right? You're not going to draw or sculpt or create the feet underneath of those shoes if they're never going to be seen. So why would you take the time to create the body or the arms or the legs or anything else underneath the clothing that's never going to be seen? Well, the main reason is to figure out proportions and figure out how much room you have to work with. But if it's a really simplistic shape and you know what you're doing, you can often get away without doing that. So here, I know generally the proportions that I want for the character. I've kind of got that locked in at this point. I think I maybe scale up the body 5% a little later on in the process, but for the most part, kind of keep it where it's at right now. So I'm a big fan of kind of, larger heads on characters. It kind of fits with the more stylistic approach that I like to lean into, which I would compare probably, and a lot of people would, to kind of like a Disney Pixar kind of style. I think the stylized terminology has become kind of bastardized over the years of 3D modeling, and I'm partially probably to blame for that. So in some ways, I want to rectify that. In a lot of my videos, I say, stylized doesn't really mean anything, because it doesn't. Stylized, it just means anything that's not realistic. And there are so many versions of stylization. You know, you have caricature, you have what I'm doing here, you have anime, you have a billion other styles that we could sit here and, you know, draw a line from realism all the way to complete, you know, abstract shapes and kind of figure out where the things on that line, you know, might lie. But yeah, so it's really hard, I think, for the individual to point to things in their own art style. It's even harder, I think, to pick out things that you want in your art style and to integrate them. I think that it takes quite a long time to achieve that. In my experience, it is something that takes repetition or kind of habit building. Because at the end of the day, in my opinion, art style is a collection of habits or a collection of things that you kind of do automatically, is how I might describe it. For example, you know, I was talking about eyes earlier. So you might have a way that you make eyes, or you might have a few different ways that you make eyes. And all of those are habits and, you know, structures and systems that you have built over the probably years of creating art to kind of create something that looks good, that you like, and works. You know, those are kind of like the three major things that you want when you're creating art. You know, some bonus things you might want, or you want it to be easy, you want it to be fast, right? I'm definitely in that encampment myself, which is why a lot of the time I'll reuse the same ear 3D model, because I have like 5 or 6 ears in this one brush that I made, and I've been updating it over the years. I haven't updated my ear since, I think, 2022 or 2023, because it works and it's a really great base that I can warp. I can make it more realistic, I can make it more stylized. So finding those chunks or those pieces in your system, your structure, your art style, essentially, I think are really, you know, hard to manipulate as you move forward, because they are habits. So if you do want to work on your art style and integrate those specific things, it is very possible. And I think sketching, like what I'm doing here, is a really fantastic way to do that. So what I recommend doing is finding those art styles or pieces of an art style, like an eye, or maybe it's the whole aesthetic, whatever it is for you, finding those things and try to pick just one specific thing to kind of focus on and bring into your artwork. That is what I recommend, and that can be, you know, hyper specific. I'm talking like down to color choices. And I think that you definitely can get it in one go, get it on your first try, but I would say expect it to take a while before you start integrating it. I think this is also something that's probably a lot easier to do in the 2D space. As a lot of you know, I started off in 3D art with little to no experience in 2D. So I have been, you know, a lot more experienced in the digital sculpting space compared to the 2D space for a very long time. But let's see, almost 3 years ago, I started a YouTube channel, Drawbly, with my wife, where we have been documenting our progress and our process of learning to draw. And I have become a lot more proficient in the 2D space. Still have a long way to go. Still really enjoying it. Still love making videos on that channel with my wife. If you're unfamiliar with it, I'll put a link down below in the description if you want to check it out. Very chill vibes, very similar to like these kinds of videos, I would say, where you know, we're kind of talking about our artwork or, you know, whatever kind of comes to mind. But yeah, to go back to what I was saying, I think that 2D art is probably a lot easier to focus on specifics of art style, because you can break that thing down into a small singular chunk, like I mentioned, and then work on that one thing repeatedly and kind of execute on it multiple times a lot faster, in my opinion, than you can do in 3D. 3D is a slower, more technical process, whereas 2D has faster abilities, at least in terms of repetition. In terms of, maybe polishing, I think things start to kind of even out a little more, but in general, I would say that 2D is much faster than 3D. So yeah, I love 3D. I'm not going to stop creating 3D art. I'm sure many of you have noticed that I've slowed down on some of my uploads here on the Follygon YouTube channel. I'm still trying to create content here, but I am definitely a lot more focused on 2D art, at least at this time, which is why I want to get in and do some more sketches in 3D, because I can kind of do a little more repetition. And in my mind, 3 hours for a character, or a little under 3 hours, is no time at all. I spend sometimes more time on 2D pieces, and that's kind of like the cutoff for my 2D skills at the moment. If I'm going over 4 hours, I'm getting into the weeds and unsure of how to kind of progress at that point. But yeah, I think in general, I would describe my approach to art as a little more maybe sketchy, or simplified might be a better term than sketchy. Because I am someone who recognized a long time ago that in the age of the internet, there is a place for highly polished, incredible, insanely detailed, specifically detailed work. However, I am not someone who enjoys creating that, and I'm not someone who necessarily values it as much as a really good, simple kind of idea. So I'm a big fan of simplification of idea, or simplification of form in the case of 3D. I don't want to sit here on this sweatshirt that I'm creating and start working on some kind of like knitted texture or sewn texture or anything like that. I don't worry about the surfacing at all, because it gets the same idea across, maybe in a less detailed form. But if you're scrolling on Instagram or whatever is the current social media thing that's happening, you most likely aren't going to stop and smell the roses and check out all the crazy, insane textures on something. As a whole, yes, it definitely adds something, but the value that it adds, at least for me, is minimal. So I tend to avoid those kinds of things. Here's me adjusting those proportions for the character's body. As I mentioned earlier, I actually had what's called a vertex mismatch, which is an issue where I'm using transpose master to scale up everything at the same time. There's that awkward torso piece as well. Very strange to see 3D models by themselves. But essentially what happened there was I had some geometry hidden and ended up causing an issue, so I had to manually rework the scale of the body. Luckily, I only scaled it up by like 5%, so it was super easy for me to do. We're kind of getting into the end part here where I am just working on doing a quick pose for the character, just turning the head slightly, tilting it, nothing too fancy. Obviously, if you're going to take a 3D character to a game or an animation kind of pipeline, you are going to keep that more neutral, T-pose, A-pose, something like that. But because this is just a 3D character sculpt, we are free to, pose our character here. I still have the neutral version saved if I ever need to go back to that. Pro tip, by the way, always save in versions. I am constantly saving multiple versions of my characters so that if I ever need to roll back a step or two, I always have that there for me. And then just kind of doing the finishing little bits of polish, or, polish as polished as you can get for a sketch. Just kind of cleaning up some little gaps or little strange areas here and there, reworking some areas of the hair to kind of make it flow a little better. Throughout this whole process, you've probably noticed me flowing back and forth through Dynamesh and ZRemesher, which is kind of my standard workflow. So I have a video on, when to use Dynamesh and ZRemesher. If you're interested in that, I'll link it below for you guys as a really cool video to check out. But before I go, here's a turntable of the character, as well as some juicy renders coming up here in a second. I know everybody loves to see the renders. I definitely love to see the renders, but there's every angle of our sketchy character. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the process. If you did, check out the links below if you want to learn more about digital sculpting. I have the Appeal Academy, which is my online program where you can learn everything I know about digital sculpting, as well as some other smaller courses, tutorials, custom brushes, microphone smacking tips, all sorts of good stuff down below in the description. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and with that, I'll see you in the next one.